So, a common question we have here at Good Therapy SF when working with our clients who are experiencing anxiety is, what do I do with it? How do I get better? And one thing I always recommend to our clients is to try to stop fighting the anxiety. Very often, the more you struggle with it, the more intense or the more internal distress you'll experience, which is only going to make those anxiety symptoms more intense, and you're going to feel worse. So, what happens is the more you try to essentially have a non acceptance approach to anxiety, those symptoms are going to intensify, very similar to the way we're told not to resist quicksand if we get caught in it. I've never been caught in quicksand, but that's what we've heard. The more you try to fight it, the deeper into the quicksand you go. Same thing applies to anxiety. When it occurs to you, the more you struggle with it, the more that kind of non accepting mentality you have, the more intense those symptoms are going to become. So as a result, what we want to do is have a more accepting approach when it comes to anxiety. So when we accept our anxiety as it's happening, that doesn't mean we approve of it. It just means we're taking a more helpful mindset when it comes to these types of symptoms, right? Initially, why does this work? Actually, in some ways, it's actually pretty validating and helpful just to acknowledge at some level that the anxiety symptoms I'm feeling right now are valid and I'm not going crazy for whatever reason. It makes sense to my brain or my mind in this moment. And this is how my mind or my brain is responding. And when you approach yourself and you approach your symptoms from that perspective, it actually reduces the internal distress you have and makes it easier to continue working through the anxiety symptoms. So, taking that more accepting approach first is a good first step. And then also using techniques such as mindfulness and, like I was saying before, validation or self compassion to help observe these anxious thoughts without judgment and without criticism are also going to be useful steps as well. Moving further beyond mindfulness and self compassion, what are actually some practical steps we can do or some practical tips for taking this mindful or accepting approach? One thing is to focus on the present moment. By that, I mean acknowledge the way you're feeling right now, but that doesn't mean you have to feel worse. You can acknowledge that you feel anxiety in this moment and then take a more proactive or useful step, something like a grounding technique. Grounding techniques are using any one of your five senses and focusing on them intensely or as best you can to get as present centered into the moment. Sometimes I'll suggest to clients to look around the room, find something like a painting or a chair or a glass of water, and try to find five specific details within that object. For example, if you're looking at a couch, you would want to say, notice the shape, but then get more granular in your observations, such as the texture of the couch or the color of it, or the type of stitching, or maybe any other kind of really hyper specific details. And the more you can use those, in that case, observational senses, the more grounded you're going to be to the moment. So that's one type of practical tip for living with anxiety. Another practical tip that helps with acceptance is going to be practicing deep breathing, often referred to as diaphragmatic breathing, because you're going to be using your diaphragm. A really common approach is to breathe in more deeply through your nose. Sometimes it's a 4 second count, sometimes it's a 7 second count. Just breathe in more deeply through your nose, hold it for a beat, and then exhale slowly out through your mouth. Sometimes it's the same amount of time that you breathe in. Sometimes it's 1 or 2 seconds longer than when you breathe in. But just focusing on your breathing in that way is really useful because, one, it helps calm the body down when we do that slower diaphragmatic breathing, but also it gives your mind something to focus on. And when you become that hyper focused in the present moment, your anxiety tends to go down. So we have focusing on observational or grounding techniques around you. We have practice deep breathing. And then the third practical tip for living with anxiety is going to be engaging in more meaningful activities. So often anxiety comes from an underlying sense that we're maybe wasting our time or engaging in things overall that we're not that interested in or we feel like aren't propelling our lives forward in the way that we would like them to be. So making sure, if not every day, then maybe a handful of times per week, checking in and making sure you're doing something with your time or some type of activity that feels meaningful to you and your overall goals, essentially for how you would like your life to be. So those kind of three practical tips are really useful and have a really nice acceptance approach to working with anxiety. And if the things we've talked about today are interesting or you want to hear more about, please feel free to reach out to us here at Good Therapy SF. Take care.